So in this part of the presentation, I want to get into return on investment from video streaming. And as part of this discussion, I really want to define the delivery of video through broadcast versus the delivery of video through over-the-top. So in the broadcast context, it's really important that we understand broadcast and OTT in the context of infrastructure. Sometimes I get questions from different individuals, what is OTT? Is it multi-screen? Is OTT video on demand? Is OTT CDN? And really the answer there is that OTT is an infrastructure which includes all of those components and even more. But when we step back a little bit, we can look at broadcast exactly in the same context. Broadcast has a studio which is generating content through news and other types of broadcast services, maybe sports, for example. And then there's a delivery component through satellite, over the air, or through a cable as the top three delivery mechanisms. And then typically the end user or the subscriber is viewing that content on their living room television. We can also look at over the top from the context of infrastructure. In this case, the data center is housing an archive of videos, but we can also use over the top for live content. The delivery mechanism is a CDN, a content delivery network, but there are many different players within this component of delivery. Typically the front-end component is the CDN connected to the OTT provider, and then there are transit providers and aggregator providers in between, which are handing over the video and peering with each other to send that video closer to the subscriber. And then there's the access provider at the final end of the chain, which we call the last mile. And in that last mile, we have the access provider, which sends the video directly to the subscriber. But generally speaking, we're trying to have a CDN which gets as close to the subscriber as possible and making sure that none of the transit or aggregator providers are acting as a bottleneck through that process. And finally, the consumption of that video is through multi-screen, TV, PC, mobile, or tablet, and it gives us much more robust viewing capabilities in terms of portability. But once again, whether it's broadcast television or over-the-top content, over-the-top is an infrastructure play and has many different components involved, right from the creation of content through to the consumption. Now let's take this to the next level and look at the comparison of broadcast television to over-the-top. And one of the reasons why I want to do this is really to give you a single slide view of some of the benefits of over-the-top content to the traditional television broadcast infrastructure. And one of them is really the viewing aspect of how we view content on television, which is typically passive. The subscriber goes to a channel, they lie back on their sofa, and then they watch whatever's on that channel. Whereas over-the-top is much more proactive, where we're actually going to a interface, an over-the-top provider, and we need to search for what we're looking for, or we're going to click on a recommendation to find content. We can also look at it in terms of regional. The broadcast is quite restrictive in terms of how far cable reaches, or the footprint of a satellite network, or how restricted, for example, over-the-air content is delivered. Whereas over-the-top is internet-based and can have a global reach. The experience for broadcast, we call this a lean-back experience. Lie back on the sofa, watch television, and we have hundreds of channels to choose from, whereas over-the-top is a lean-forward and then a lean-back experience. So we lean forward to choose what we want. Once we've chosen what we want, then we lean back and watch that content. Next is an audience. So the broadcast television audience is quite general from a broadcaster perspective. They have a general view of the age group that's interested in their channels, the gender, the other types of cultural demographics that play a role. Whereas over the top, it's very specific in terms of not only knowing the demographics of each subscriber, but specifically knowing their viewing behavior and other types of purchasing behavior that can be added, because now we have much more of a one-to-one relationship. It's more of a unicast relationship, as we say on the internet, versus a broadcast or a multicast relationship in broadcast television. Next is where we're actually viewing that content in broadcast is typically the living room, and over the top is by default multiple screens. And finally, the feature set. In terms of broadcast, it's quite limited. In terms of the electronic programming guide that we've been familiar with, those of you that have used the red button was another attempt to add some features to broadcast, but that has arguably not succeeded to the level that broadcasters have wanted. Picture-in-picture, for those of you that bought a television because of picture-in-picture, how many of us have actually used that? Over the top, on the other hand, we're looking at access to the internet. So we have access to millions of different applications. But even within the context of an OTT platform, we have within OTT platforms a recommendation engine, rating, statistics, social networking, interaction, and it's much more of an interactive behavior that we're very familiar with in the computing environment. And that behavior we're now using in an entertainment context. Next, I want to look at the aspect of an appliance television versus cloud-based service. This is an interesting perspective because it really looks at how the set-top box has become quite a prominent appliance within the subscriber's home, and how cloud-based services have really overshadowed the value that a set-top box has provided a subscriber. So one of the advantages, for example, of a set-top box is we get local storage. Maybe there's a few hundreds of gigabytes or even a terabyte of storage space, and that gives us the ability to store as many programs as we can on that storage that sits within the set-top box. We can skip ads now that we've stored the content, and of course a lot of ad providers are not very happy with that. Subscriber disadvantages is that content is not portable. It's sitting in the set-top box, but we can't port that content now to our mobile phones or our tablet. We can't pause content on our television and then replay that content on a mobile phone and so on. So the portability aspect is a concern. Now, there are also an aspect of provider advantages and disadvantages from an appliance. So providers like the set-top box because it gives them application control. They control the applications on the set-top box, and therefore they can control the subscriber, they control the digital rights management, and therefore the content is safe. So it's the clients are somewhat locked within that service, and that provides some safety measures for that provider in securing their content. But there are also some disadvantages because set-top boxes are expensive and they have to be amortized over the cost of that service, and that increases the cost of the service. We can look at this also from the standpoint of the cloud-based subscriber advantages and disadvantages. The subscriber advantages, now that it's in the cloud, we have infinite storage. Now you can wonder how can it be infinite in storage? Well, one of the reasons is ultimately we're in an environment where a OTT provider can have one instance of that content. Let's say they have 10,000 titles and they have one instance in the cloud. All the subscriber needs to do in terms of saving their playlist, for example, is a text file which points to the content they want, or just points to the in and out points in the timeline of live content so they can watch it sometime in the future. And that text file could be as large as they want, typically as large as watching content for the rest of their life and never having to repeat any of the content that they're watching even once. They also get better quality because those 10,000 pieces of content can then be upgraded into the future, let's say to 4K or even better compression, and then every single subscriber on that service gets to take advantage of that better quality once it's available. Provider advantages in the cloud, there's a one-to-one relationship. They have much more understanding of who their audience is because they have that one-to-one relationship, and therefore that allows them to give them more relevant ads. And some of the disadvantages once it's in the cloud is because they don't have a set-top box anymore and they have access to the internet, then there's this sense of losing control of the subscriber. Another thing that I want to look at is really the monetization of the long tail. And long tail discussions are quite important in the context of OTT. This is a graph that shows popularity and revenue and how, for example, a movie and TV show has a very big revenue potential in the first opening weekend and several weekends after that, but then has this exponential decay as it progresses through time. When we look at, for example, a news or sports broadcast, then that is going to spike even higher then it loses its value much faster. The third example is we can look at a cult classic. It may not be successful in the opening weekend, but because of the fan base that it generates over time, it sustains a certain level of revenue. So as we move over time, eventually all content moves into the long tail and moves towards the right. And then we get a bunching of the number of titles as time progresses. Hundreds of thousands of titles end up residing there, and it gets harder and harder for any given subscriber to ever discover that content. When we look at the difference between television and OTT, broadcast sits very well in terms of head-end content. The information, the programming that's live or premium content such as movies and TV shows are very effective for advertising, promoting that content, and really trying to increase that spike as high as possible. What really works well for OTT content is the long tail. And this really gives an opportunity for video libraries, a resurgence of interest of content into the long tail so that subscribers can really discover content that they may not know exists. And this brings subscribers into the long tail of content and discover older content that still may be of interest to them, and opens that library up in a much more robust way in comparison to broadcast television. That leads into this slide, and we look at content discovery from the standpoint of pushing that content to a user or pulling that content. So if we want to find content from a push perspective, then we're looking at a Google-based search. In terms of looking for anything on the internet, we need to ask the right question in Google so that we can get to our answer on the first page. In a pull scenario of content discovery, we don't really need to be proactive anymore. We just have a recommendation of content which pulls content to them, and that could be through collaborative behavior. It could be user ratings of content. It could be statistics, reviews, testimonials, their likes and dislikes, which modify the recommendations that they receive, or it could be their buying and viewing behavior, which also adds into a robust content discovery and recommendation engine. So there is this migration of content discovery from a proactive need of pushing and finding that content yourself to having a more automated approach to recommendations of content through a recommendation engine. What I've done here is I've combined the cost associated to OTT platforms from AccuStream and mapped that to Informa's revenue generation of OTT through transaction, subscription, and advertising revenue. And what this basically turns out to be is a 32-to-1 return on investment, which means that for every dollar we're investing in an OTT platform, we're generating $32 in OTT revenue. Now, the numbers here are somewhat skewed and not necessarily realistic, but what this gives us is just an overview of the hardware and software costs of an OTT platform to the actual revenue that would be generated on the other end. And that hardware and software cost, it doesn't necessarily give us a total cost of ownership, but it is an interesting comparison when we map the two figures together.